Hello and welcome. Let's get you caught up on some key global stories making news today.
First up, in Germany, the Foreign Office is standing by its decision to classify the alternative for Deutschland, the AfD party, as right-wing extremist.
Right, and that's drawn some pretty sharp criticism from the U.S., hasn't it?
It has. Vice President J.D. Vance, he likened it to rebuilding the Berlin Wall, and Marco Rubio called it tyranny in disguise.
Strong words. How did Germany respond?
They replied directly on X, basically referencing lessons learned from history about extremism. Germany's intelligence agency, the BfV, says the AfD's views on ethnicity clash with the country's democratic foundations.
And they specifically mentioned views on citizens from Muslim countries.
Yes, saying the party doesn't see them as equal. This classification, well, it gives authorities more power to monitor the AfD.
Even though they're doing quite well electorally, second place, I believe.
That's right, 20.8% in recent federal elections. AfD leaders, naturally, are calling the decision politically motivated, even comparing it to authoritarian tactics.
Okay, let's shift focus. There's news about a flotilla heading towards Gaza.
Yes, the Freedom Flotilla Coalition says their ship, the Conscience, was hit by drones. This happened in international waters near Malta.
Drones, what are the details?
Well, they sent out an SOS. There's a recording of the captain reporting drone strikes and a fire on board. The Israeli military says it's looking into the reports.
And this flotilla was trying to reach Gaza, which is under blockade.
Exactly. They'd been secretive about their plans to avoid potential sabotage. A volunteer confirmed losing contact, mentioned the fire, hull damage, but thankfully no major injuries reported.
Wasn't Greta Thunberg supposed to be involved?
She was planning to join. She called this an attack on a humanitarian mission, trying to break the Gaza siege. Malta sent a tugboat, confirmed the crew were safe, but they didn't board it.
This comes amid wider criticism of the Gaza blockade.
Yes, growing international pressure. The UK, France, Germany, their foreign ministers have all voiced concerns recently about the humanitarian situation there.
Okay. Moving across the Atlantic, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has spoken post-election.
He has. First news conference since the vote. He outlined his priorities, and talking with U.S. President Trump is apparently high on the agenda.
Which makes sense given his campaign focus on standing up to Trump's tariff threats.
Exactly. And those comments Trump made about Canada becoming the 51st state. The Liberals won, but it's a minority government, 168 seats.
And did Carney address domestic concerns?
He did. He acknowledged voters are worried about the cost of living and community safety. Interestingly, those were key conservative themes, but their leader, Pierre Poilievre, actually lost his own seat.
Let's look at the U.S. markets now. A pretty long winning streak.
Yeah, quite remarkable. U.S. shares have gained for 9 consecutive days. That's the longest run since 2004, apparently.
What's driving it?
Seems to be a combination of things. A better-than-expected jobs report, for one, and also growing hopes for U.S.-China trade talks.
So the major indexes are up?
Yes. The S&P 500, NASDAQ, Dow Jones all closed higher. Tech stocks like Microsoft and NVIDIA did particularly well.
And the jobs report?
The Labor Department said 177,000 new jobs were added in April. Unemployment held steady at 4.2%.
And China is considering talks, despite the high tariffs.
That's the word. Economists are a bit divided, though. Some see this data easing recession fears. Others are still cautious about the long-term impact of tariffs and, general uncertainty.
Right. Now, turning to the Middle East again. Reports of Israeli strikes near the Syrian presidential palace.
Yes, Israel confirmed its jets bombed an area near the palace in Damascus. They stated the aim was to protect the Druze religious minority following recent deadly sectarian violence.
This isn't the first time Israel has struck in Syria recently.
No, there were previous strikes south of Damascus during clashes. The UN Secretary General Guterres, he criticized this latest bombing as a violation of Syria's sovereignty.
How are the Druze leaders reacting?
Well, one prominent spiritual leader condemned the sectarian violence, targeting them as an unjustifiable genocidal campaign, calling for international help. Others affirmed their commitment to a unified Syria, urging the state to protect people in Suweda province.
And the Syrian government's response?
They've deployed security forces to deal with what they call outlaw groups. A Druze leader described the situation as still very tense.
Context here, Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu has previously warned against threats to the Druze community.
He has, demanding demilitarization in southern Syria. Israel has a history of military strikes inside Syria, often targeting Iranian-linked assets or weapon shipments.
Okay. Back in the U.S., there's news about a military parade.
Yes, the White House confirmed a parade for June 14th. It's marking the U.S. Army's 250th anniversary, which also happens to be President Trump's birthday. It's planned for the National Mall.
And President Trump also made some announcements about renaming holidays.
He did. He announced plans to rename Veterans Day to Victory Day for World War I and VE Day to Victory Day for World War II. He cited American contributions and a perceived lack of celebrating victories.
But does he have the power to do that unilaterally?
No, creating federal holidays rests with Congress. And interestingly, the White House press secretary later seemed to walk back the Veterans Day part, saying they remain committed to honoring Veterans Day while also commemorating the end of the World Wars.
Okay. A quick note on a sentencing in the U.S.
Yes, a very disturbing case.
Right.
A U.S. man got a 53-year sentence for fatally stabbing a 6-year-old Palestinian-American child. Testimony revealed the attacker made anti-Muslim remarks during the assault.
Just horrific. He attacked the mother as well.
Yes, forced his way in, stabbed the mother multiple times before stabbing the boy 26 times. The evidence at trial included crime scene photos.
Let's move to tech regulation now. Meta is having issues in Nigeria.
It seems so. Meta is warning that Facebook and Instagram access might be cut off for Nigerians. They're citing large fines and what they call unrealistic regulatory demands.
How large are the fines?
Over $290 million total, imposed last year by various Nigerian agencies for alleged violations. Meta tried to fight them in court, but lost.
So they might just shut down services.
They're saying it might be necessary to mitigate the risks. Interestingly, WhatsApp wasn't mentioned. The fines relate to things like competition rules, advertising standards, and data privacy.
What's the specific sticking point on data privacy?
Meta says the demand for prior approval before transferring any personal data out of Nigeria is unrealistic. They argue the Nigerian data agency isn't interpreting the privacy laws correctly.
Okay. And a brief update from Hong Kong.
Police there have arrested the family of Agnes Chow, a prominent pro-democracy activist now in exile.
Under what law?
The new Safeguarding National Security Bill. It makes it illegal to provide financial support to relevant absconders. Chow was among several activists Hong Kong put a bounty on last year, accusing them of colluding with foreign forces.
Turning to South Africa, a verdict in a missing child case.
Yes, a very sad case. Kelly Smith has been found guilty of kidnapping and trafficking her own 6-year-old daughter, Jocelyn. She disappeared over a year ago.
And others were convicted too.
Her boyfriend and a friend were also found guilty. They'd all pleaded not guilty. Little Jocelyn, unfortunately, still hasn't been found despite massive searches.
What did the prosecution allege?
That Smith sold, delivered, or exchanged her daughter and lied about the disappearance. Testimony during the trial included some shocking claims, like Smith allegedly saying she sold Jocelyn to a traditional healer, a sangoma, for her body parts.
Goodness. Were there other such claims?
Yes, testimony about her discussing selling children for money and telling a teacher her daughter was on a ship to West Africa. The defense tried to poke holes in these accounts, citing inconsistencies.
What kind of sentence are they facing?
Potentially life sentences. The police say the search for Jocelyn will continue. It's really highlighted the vulnerability of children in some poorer communities there.
Now, an earthquake and tsunami warning in South America.
That's right. Coastal areas of Chile and Argentina saw evacuations after Chilean authorities issued a tsunami warning.
What caused it?
A significant earthquake, 7.4 magnitude, off Chile's southern coast in the Drake Passage. The warning covered Chile's Magallanes region and its Antarctic territory. Argentina took precautions in Tierra del Fuego.
Were people actually evacuated?
Yes, Chilean research bases in Antarctica followed procedures. And in Argentina, around 2,000 people were moved away from the coastline near Ushuaia, where the quake was mostly felt. Chile, as you know, is very prone to earthquakes.
Okay. In Uganda, there's controversy involving the president's son.
Yes. General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, who's often seen as his father's potential successor, has confirmed his forces are detaining Edward Sabufu. He's the bodyguard of opposition leader Bobi Wine.
And Sabufu had been missing.
For 5 days, reportedly abducted. General Kainerugaba, who's known for controversial social media posts, basically announced the capture online, even mentioning shaving the bodyguard's beard.
On what grounds is he being held?
The general hasn't specified charges or location, just said he'd only release him if his father, the president, orders it. Police initially denied holding Sabufu.
How is the opposition responding?
They're demanding Sabufu be produced in court. Bobi Wine accused the general of illegal detention and torture and called for a solidarity rally.
Right. Briefly, a strange incident on an Australian highway.
Yes, a truck somehow spilled 750 kilograms of sharp metal shards across a busy highway. It traveled about 30 kilometers before it was noticed.
That must have caused chaos.
It did. Lanes closed for hours, and at least 300 cars got punctured tires, including emergency vehicles. They're investigating how it happened.
Back to U.S. politics and Ukraine, comments from Vice President Vance.
Yes, J.D. Vance said in an interview that the war in Ukraine is not going to end anytime soon. He suggested the U.S. should help Russia and Ukraine find middle ground.
But he thinks the final decision rests with them.
Ultimately, yes. This came shortly after the U.S. signed that deal with Kyiv about Ukraine's rare earth minerals in exchange for future security assistance. Vance also defended President Trump's approach to the war.
Now, some sad news from the music world.
Indeed. Jill Sobule, the U.S. songwriter known for her hit I Kissed a Girl, arguably the first openly gay-themed song to hit the Billboard Top 20, has died.
How did she pass away?
Tragically, in a house fire in Minneapolis, she was 66. Many remember her satirical song Supermodel from the movie Clueless as well.
A real loss. She was quite pioneering, wasn't she?
Absolutely. Tackled tough subjects like the death penalty, anorexia, LGBTQ+ rights, and she was one of the first major artists to use crowdfunding. Tributes are pouring in from fellow musicians. Police are investigating the cause of the fire.
Staying with cultural topics, there's a film relevant to the upcoming papal election.
Yes, the movie Conclave. It comes as 134 cardinals are preparing to gather in the Sistine Chapel to elect a successor to Pope Francis.
A very secretive process, usually.
Streetly. Lots of tradition. The film apparently sheds some light on it, the intense isolation the cardinals face, the politicking involved, the potential for unpredictability, and, well, the fact that they are human and fallible.
Interesting timing. Let's switch gears to e-commerce. Temu is changing its U.S. operations.
It is. They've announced they'll stop selling goods imported directly from China to U.S. customers.
Yeah.
Instead, sales will go through locally based sellers with orders fulfilled within the U.S.
Why the change?
It coincides with the closing of a duty-free loophole, the de minimis exemption for low-value packages. Temu and its rival Shein had benefited significantly from this rule, which allowed packages under $800 to enter the U.S. tax-free.
And U.S. authorities had concerns about that loophole.
They did. Concerns about it being used to smuggle illegal goods, including drugs, and also about the competitive disadvantage for U.S. businesses. This move aligns with the broader crackdown on goods from China under both the current and previous administrations.
Okay. In India, a disturbing report about a school meal.
Yes. India's human rights body is investigating reports that over 100 children fell ill after a dead snake was found in their school lunch in Bihar state.
A snake. And they still serve the food.
Allegedly, the cook removed the snake and served the lunch anyway. There have been local protests. This involves the midday meal scheme, which aims to combat hunger, but has unfortunately faced food hygiene issues before.
Right. Let's get an update on the fires in Israel.
The major fires in central Israel are now reported to be largely extinguished after massive efforts. Over 150 fire teams were involved.
Were there casualties?
At least 12 people were treated for smoke inhalation, and sadly, 17 firefighters were injured. Conditions were very challenging: hot, dry weather, strong winds.
Was there an evacuation?
Yes. Prime Minister Netanyahu declared a national emergency, and 12 towns were evacuated. Those orders have now been lifted. International assistance was also received. The cause of the fire is still being investigated.
Turning to Tanzania, an attack on a prominent priest.
Yes. Father Charles Kitima, a well-known Catholic priest and sometimes government critic, was violently attacked near his home in Dar es Salaam. He's reported to be in stable condition.
Any leads on who is responsible?
Police have detained one suspect. The attack has been widely condemned, including by the U.S. Embassy, which called for a transparent investigation. This happens amid rising political tensions and concerns about shrinking civic space in the country ahead of elections.
Okay, now for a rather unusual story about antivenom development.
This is quite something. Scientists have developed what they're calling an unparalleled antivenom bee using antibodies from a man named Tim Fried.
And what's special about him?
He spent nearly 2 decades deliberately injecting himself with venom from various deadly snakes. He's been bitten over 200 times.
Why would he do that?
Initially, it seems to build immunity for himself, but later his focus shifted to helping develop better therapies for snakebite victims globally.
So his antibodies are uniquely powerful.
Apparently so. In animal tests, antivenom derived from his antibodies protected against fatal doses from a wide range of snake species. This is a big deal because current antivenoms are usually species-specific.
So this could lead to a universal antivenom.
That's the hope. Researchers identified specific, broadly neutralizing antibodies in his blood. Tests on mice showed survival against venom from 13 out of 19 deadly elapid species and partial protection against the rest. Work is ongoing to refine it and target viper venoms too.
Fascinating. Let's move to Eastern Europe. Concerns about Russia prompting military training in Poland.
Yes, ordinary Polish citizens are signing up for military training programs. There's one called Train with the Army, teaching basic combat skills, weapon handling, first aid.
What's the motivation?
Pretty clear concern about the military threat from Russia, as one Army captain put it. The programs are reportedly oversubscribed, and the government plans to expand them. Poland is already spending a high percentage of its GDP on defense.
Are people really expecting to fight?
Some participants say they would volunteer if Poland were attacked, citing historical lessons about self-reliance. Demand for private bomb shelters has also surged. However, a poll suggests not everyone is ready to take up arms. A significant number said they'd flee.
A complex picture. Now, an investigation into a deadly migrant crossing.
Yes. Our correspondent Verify has been tracking a people smuggler known as Fadi Gujar, whose real name is Kawar Hassan. He's believed responsible for a boat crossing in the Atlantic back in January where many migrants died.
How did they track him?
Through social media, financial transactions, and survivor testimony. He apparently recruited people, mostly from Pakistan, promising passage to Europe via Mauritania, which has become a smuggling hub.
A dangerous route.
Extremely. Survivors paid him thousands of dollars for a journey that ended tragically. The boat was overcrowded, and people died from violence, starvation, and hypothermia. Pakistani authorities have named him, but he's still at large, last tracked via social media in Azerbaijan.
And his family.
His mother and brother were detained in Pakistan, allegedly for collecting money on his behalf. Evidence suggests he continued facilitating journeys even after the January disaster.
Turning to Kashmir, reports of violence against Kashmiris in India.
Yes. Following a deadly militant attack on Hindus in Pahalgam, Kashmir, there are reports of backlash against Kashmiri shawl sellers elsewhere in India.
Can you give an example?
A seller named Shubir Ahmad Dar, who'd worked in Mussoorie for 20 years, was assaulted along with a colleague. They and other Kashmiri sellers felt unsafe and left the town.
Is this linked to the security situation in Kashmir?
It seems so. After the Pahalgam attack, where survivors said Hindu men were targeted, Indian security forces launched a major crackdown in Kashmir, detentions, closures, even demolishing homes of alleged militants' families, which critics call collective punishment.
How are Kashmiri leaders reacting?
Figures like Omar Abdullah and Mahbooba Mufti have condemned the demolitions and called for punishing the guilty without harming innocent people. There have been protests. Mr. Dar, the shawl seller, is now displaced, his livelihood gone, and his son is missing after being detained.
A very difficult situation. Let's revisit the U.S.-China trade dynamic. Any movement on talks?
Well, China has publicly stated it's assessing the possibility of tariff negotiations with the U.S. But the high tariffs remain in place, impacting trade.
So are talks actually likely?
Analysts are skeptical about immediate breakthroughs. It's seen partly as posturing. Neither side wants to look desperate to talk, as that weakens their bargaining position. Both Trump and Xi need to project strength domestically.
China has its own economic challenges too, right?
It does. So while assessing talks, they're also focusing on boosting domestic demand and diversifying trade partners away from the U.S. The U.S. hasn't explicitly denied China's claims about wanting talks, suggesting some contact might be happening behind the scenes, but a genuine resolution seems distant for now.
Okay. Shifting to Australia's election campaign, candidates are using Chinese social media.
Yes, particularly opposition candidates are actively using platforms like WeChat and RedNote to reach Chinese Australian voters.
Why the focus there?
WeChat is hugely popular in that community, and Chinese Australian voters played a significant role in swinging seats towards Labor in the last election. They traditionally leaned conservative, so the shift was notable. Campaigns are now targeting them more extensively with ads and even influencer collaborations.
Is this just ethnic Chinese candidates?
No, non-ethnic Chinese politicians are also using these platforms, sometimes with Mandarin subtitles or audio translations, recognizing the need to reach voters with lower English proficiency. It does raise some debate, given national security concerns sometimes voiced about platforms like WeChat.
And what are the key concerns for Chinese Australian voters?
Issues like increased racism, the impact of strained Australia-China relations on business, and anxiety about anti-migrant rhetoric are reportedly resonating.
Staying with the Australian election, Donald Trump's influence seems to be a factor.
A significant one, yes. Labor is currently leading in the polls, and analysts say Trump is a looming figure, forcing Australia to really examine its relationship with the U.S.
The U.S. alliance is historically crucial for Australia.
Absolutely, especially with the rise of China and alliances like AUKUS. But polls show many Australians view a potential Trump return negatively and have low trust in the U.S. under him.
How are the Australian leaders handling this?
Opposition leader Peter Dutton initially tried to position himself as suited to dealing with Trump, but seemed to backpedal somewhat due to public opinion. Prime Minister Albanese is trying to reassure people about the stability of alliances, regardless of who is in the White House.
Could Trump actually be helping Albanese?
Some analysts think so. The idea is that perceived instability or crisis, like a potentially disruptive Trump presidency, might make voters stick with the incumbent leader they know, a sort of rally around the flag effect, perhaps similar to what happened in Canada.
Interesting dynamic. Let's return to the situation in Gaza. The humanitarian crisis continues.
It's incredibly dire due to the ongoing Israeli blockade. Community kitchens run by aid groups like Anera are struggling to provide even basic meals like koshari, as meat and fresh vegetables aren't getting in.
Have UN food stocks run out?
Reports indicate UN agencies have used up their food aid stocks inside Gaza. International pressure on Israel to lift the blockade is intense, with warnings of mass starvation and potential war crimes.
What are people on the ground saying?
They describe a tragic situation, lack of food, no income, no essential supplies. This is all happening while Israeli hostages taken in the initial Hamas attack remain captive. President Trump recently told Netanyahu publicly to be good to Gaza and allow more aid. Israel rejects criticism of the blockade.
A quick historical note now commemorating the Shetland bus.
Yes, marking the 80th anniversary of VE Day. 6 historic fishing boats that were part of the Shetland bus operation during World War II are retracing their journey from Norway to Shetland.
What was the Shetland bus?
It was a clandestine operation running agents, supplies, and refugees between Nazi-occupied Norway and Shetland, often in treacherous winter conditions on the North Sea. Many lives were lost. It forged a very strong bond between Shetland and Norway.
A poignant commemoration. Let's briefly revisit that U.S.-Ukraine resources deal. Key takeaways.
Right, there are about 7 main points emerging. 1, Ukraine isn't required to pay back previous U.S. aid, despite Trump's claims. 2, it sets principles aiming to prevent those who funded Russia's war from profiting from reconstruction.
Does it cover oil and gas?
Yes, along with minerals, but Ukraine retains ownership. 4, it's designed not to hinder Ukraine's EU ambitions. 5, the U.S. frames it as crucial for continued military aid.
But Trump sees it differently.
6, Trump seems to view it as a form of repayment for U.S. aid. And finally, 7, the deal still needs ratification by Ukraine's parliament.
Okay. Inside Israel now, reports of dissent among reservists about the Gaza war.
Yes, there appears to be growing opposition. Thousands of reservists have reportedly signed letters urging the government to prioritize a deal to release the hostages still held in Gaza.
This is a shift from the initial consensus.
It seems so. Initial broad support for the war fractured after the last ceasefire ended without a lasting resolution. Signatories include longtime Netanyahu critics, but also others acting out of national concern, questioning the war's objectives and leadership.
Are there specific examples?
Open letters started appearing, first from Air Force reservists, then other branches. Attendance for reserve duty has reportedly dropped significantly. Some reservists who served in Gaza say they wouldn't go back now, feeling disillusioned. There are concerns the prolonged war damages Israel morally.
How is the government responding?
Prime Minister Netanyahu has largely dismissed the protesters' concerns. However, polls suggest public support for prioritizing hostage release is high, and there have been significant anti-war demonstrations in Tel Aviv.
Let's head to Singapore. The ruling party is trying to woo younger voters online.
That's right. The People's Action Party, or PP, which has ruled Singapore for decades, is stepping up its social media game, TikTok videos, influencer collaborations, podcasts.
Why that push now?
While still dominant, the PAP has seen its vote share decline in recent elections, hitting record lows. They recognize they need to connect better with younger generations to secure their future. Prime Minister Lawrence Wong himself has a large online following.
Will it work?
It's hard to say. They have far more resources for digital campaigning than the opposition. But some young voters say authenticity matters more than slick online content. The government's also trying to address youth concerns about cost of living and housing offline.
Okay. In Uganda, again, an environmental concern about shade trees.
Yes, the population of shea nut trees is declining rapidly, primarily due to demand for charcoal, but also climate change. Activists like Mustafa Jarima are campaigning to protect them.
Why are they cut for charcoal?
Shea wood makes high-quality charcoal, which fetches a good price, especially with rapid urbanization increasing energy demand. This deforestation directly impacts local communities, especially women who traditionally harvest the nuts to make shea butter.
Are there efforts to combat this?
There's a government ban on cutting trees for charcoal, but enforcement is difficult. Experts say alternatives are needed, along with affirmative planting, actively planting new trees. There are also efforts using AI to map existing trees.
Back to the US-China trade war one last time. How is China responding internally?
Beyond the official statements, you see things like mocking memes about the tariffs online. But economically, China faces challenges beyond just the trade war. The government is trying to boost domestic demand and, as we mentioned, diversify trade partners.
Could the trade war offer China any advantages?
Geopolitically, perhaps. It might push some countries closer to Beijing if they feel Washington is unreliable or overly aggressive on trade. Xi Jinping visited Southeast Asia right after the latest tariff announcements, likely reinforcing those relationships. But China also has to be careful not to flood markets and provoke backlash itself.
Now, an election scandal involving TikTok, this time in Romania.
Yes, Romania's presidential election results were annulled, partly due to allegations of Russian interference and manipulation, primarily on TikTok. A far-right candidate, Kellen Georgescu, had a surprise first-round win before being banned and investigated.
What specifically was alleged about TikTok?
Accusations involve influencers being paid to artificially boost Georgescu's profile using fake accounts and coordinate campaigns, including a hashtag campaign funded through an agency called FameUp, though the ultimate source of the funds was initially unclear. Posts weren't marked as ads.
Was there concrete evidence of Russian involvement?
Authorities cited similarities to Russian operations elsewhere and mentioned intelligence about cyber attacks. But concrete proof linking Russia directly to the TikTok manipulation wasn't presented publicly. It later emerged Romania's own center-right party had paid for the hashtag campaign, claiming it was hijacked.
And an influencer was arrested.
Yes, Bogdan Pashir, dubbed the king of TikTok, was arrested for alleged voter corruption, accused of giving gifts on TikTok to encourage votes for Georgescu, which his lawyers deny. It's a messy situation that led to the election annulment.
Let's turn to Iraqi Kurdistan. Turkish military presence causing issues.
Yes, Turkey's military footprint in the border region, sometimes called the Forbidden Zone, is growing significantly. Villages like Suzdale report seeing more Turkish bases losing farmland and feeling increasingly occupied.
Why is Turkey there?
Turkey says it's fighting the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which it considers a terrorist group. But the increased presence, dozens of new bases since 2018, has led to civilian casualties and displacement. Towns like Kanimasi are largely empty.
Does the Iraqi government object?
Iraq and Turkey have an understanding to jointly fight the PKK, but Baghdad seems unable or unwilling to limit the Turkish troop presence, partly due to Iraq's internal divisions and dependence on Turkey. Locals feel caught in the middle, suffering losses like farmer Alan Chishu, killed near a Turkish base. There are even allegations local authorities sometimes obscure Turkish responsibility for civilian deaths.
Finally, let's look at Vietnam 50 years after the war ended, facing new challenges.
Yes, ironically, 50 years after the fall of Saigon, Vietnam, which has seen huge economic growth and wants to be a major manufacturing hub, is facing the threat of potentially crippling U.S. tariffs under President Trump's proposals up to 40%.
How is Vietnam positioned now?
Most Vietnamese, especially the young, want to look forward, trade with the world, including the U.S. Many factories, some set up by businesses moving from China, now export heavily to the U.S. That tariff threat is causing real anxiety and uncertainty, forcing factories to pause plans.
So Vietnam is caught between the U.S. and China.
Exactly. It performs a delicate balancing act, trying to maintain good relations with both superpowers. Xi Jinping also visited recently. It's a complex situation for a country focused on economic development after decades of conflict.
Well, that brings us to the end of this roundup. From political classifications in Germany to trade shifts and humanitarian crises, you can really see how interconnected global events are.
Absolutely. It definitely gives you a lot to think about regarding the forces shaping our world today.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us and staying informed.